American Airlines is the biggest airliner in the world, and it has held that title since the year 1936, and it is still the biggest to this day. In the beginning of the 1970s, American Airlines is trying to make a deal with McDonnell Douglas or Boeing to buy an airplane for long distance travel. The Boeing has the very famous 747 coming out soon, and McDonnell Douglas has a new airplane which is not as big, but it's meant for long distances, called the DC-10.
That's a 747, but able to land at almost any commercial airport. Introducing the new DC-10 luxury liner with a lounge and coach and first class.
Right here, American Airlines makes a huge mistake because they buy the DC-10 as their main long travel plane. In the year 1972, one of the first DC-10s was working, and it was being used as a cargo airplane. In one of these flights, the rear door of the DC-10 rips out, but luckily nothing bad happens, and the pilot can bring the plane down and land it carefully without anyone being hurt. But unfortunately, only 2 years later, the people on Turkish Airlines weren't so lucky. 330 people were on board, and the Turkish Airlines DC-10 takes off to go to London. Only a few minutes after takeoff, the rear piece of the DC-10 rips out, which basically makes the airplane convertible. And the pressure change was so insane that the pilots couldn't control the airplane whatsoever, and it just took a nosedive all the way down, smashing into the ground, killing all 335 people on board. DC-10 has barely entered the market of airliners, and it has already had 2 insane incidents. When you fast forward 5 years later, on the 25th of May 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago is getting ready to take off. This airplane has 271 souls on board, and since it's going to Los Angeles, it has damn near a full tank of fuel, so you can't say it's empty. The main captain was 53-year-old Walter Lux, co-pilot was 49-year-old James Dillard, and the flight engineer was 56-year-old Alfred Yudovich. So the cockpit was extremely experienced with tens of thousands of hours of experience. They were getting ready, and at 3:04 p.m., the control tower gives them the green light to go ahead and take off. Pilot Dillard takes the plane to the runway and pretty much goes full throttle to take off. The speed of the aircraft reaches 250 kilometers an hour, also known as V1. When an aircraft reaches V1 speed, it basically cannot abort mission. It has to take off. There is no more room to slow down anymore. So that's why the pilot lifted up the nose to take off. The airplane takes off, but all of a sudden, a huge bam is heard in the cockpit. And the control tower has the recording of one of the pilots saying, "Damn." After the "damn" is said, the control tower cannot hear the airplane anymore. Because this DC-10 has completely lost electricity and they don't know what's happening. One of the employees of the control tower hears the damn and immediately looks at the runway to see what the DC-10 is doing. And this is the situation he sees. There are even photographers around that area that take photos like this. But why is the airplane tilted like that? Because while the airplane took off, the left engine literally got ripped off. And since the pilots did not know what has happened, they didn't know how to properly control it. And since they didn't understand what's happening, the airplane was tilted 90 degrees to the side. And when the control tower saw a situation like this, they were hopeless. They knew the airplane was gonna go down. So they immediately hit the emergency button for the firefighters and the ambulances to show up immediately around the explosion. An airplane that looks like a bomb. More than 270 people on board, damn near full with jet fuel, and it's going down and it's gonna go down hard. The airplane comes down hard and it hits one of the warehouses that the auto mechanics used to work at. The explosion was so massive that people from the other side of Chicago heard it. Since it was the afternoon, in this warehouse there were only 2 employees working. But because of the impact and the fire, both of these employees died. But out of the aircraft, not a single soul survived either. All 271 people had died and their bodies had burned. It is interesting to know that next to this airport there's an oil refinery, and when this explosion happened and they saw the fireball, a lot of people, including the fire department, thought the refinery had exploded. So they got to that area and realized no, it happened inside the airport, and they very quickly realized that it was an aircraft that exploded. This incident is known as the biggest airplane crash in US history. After this accident took place, experts came to see what had happened because it was extremely weird for an airplane to take off and a few seconds later come crashing down. They knew one of the engines had ripped off before the accident, but they wanted to know why. Something like this had never happened before. What is McDonnell Douglas thinking? They released an airplane that wants to compete with the 747, but they already had 3 insane incidences, and hundreds of people died. This is when the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, announced that all DC-10s have to be grounded until we figure out what has happened. Even though the FAA was an American administration, a lot of overseas airliners listened to this and they grounded their DC-10s as well to wait until something has happened, because the news of this accident was that big around the world. The more the experts tried to figure out why the engine ripped out, they really couldn't, until they looked at the maintenance records. They realized that 2 months ago in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the same airplane had some work done to it and it had the left engine replaced. And this is when the experts realized what has happened. The technicians that worked on this aircraft, instead of just removing the jet engine alone, they pretty much removed the engine mount with the jet engine together. And they put the engine brace on the new jet engine and connect them to the wings together. This is not the correct procedure to replace a jet engine on a DC-10 because things could not line up correctly, and things like this have to be extremely precise because you're not joking around. This is not a bicycle. Not only wasn't it bolted down correctly, it was actually loose as well. This is what separates a responsible person and an irresponsible person. One irresponsibility could cause hundreds of people to die in a split second. When experts looked at other DC-10 maintenance records, they realized, wow, a lot of technicians around the country are doing the same procedure to replace jet engines. It's basically because it's quicker to do it this way, but it's not the correct way. They examined other DC-10s and realized that there are minor cracks on these braces. So if these DC-10s continue to fly, the same exact incident would happen. After this incident, the FAA put the blame on the technicians of American Airlines, and the airliner was fined $500,000 for this. But this was just a fine that the FAA put on them. You have to know that any airplane that wants to lift off, before any liftoff, it has to be fully inspected. After everything is gone through and no issues has been found, the airplane is good to go for takeoff. The technician that inspected American Airlines Flight 191 was a gentleman named Earl Russell. And unfortunately, after hearing this news, a few months after, he took his own life. Even though he wasn't the main person at fault, because there's no way you could have seen those cracks unless you took apart the engine, and it was actually the technician's fault. Every DC-10 was inspected, and that problem was pretty much solved. So the DC-10 was allowed to fly once again, and it hasn't had an incident ever since. After the year 2000, American Airlines stopped using the DC-10 for more modern, better aircrafts. But that doesn't mean that the DC-10 is not being used. There are airlines, including FedEx, that still use this aircraft to this day. And thankfully, nothing bad has taken place. It is interesting to note that this accident is a teaching point to technicians and engineers that want to get into the aircraft world. With this incident, they teach men and women If you are irresponsible, things like this will happen. So people's lives are literally in your hands.